December 16, 1944, 5:30 a.m., the Ardennes forest erupts. 1,600 German artillery pieces open fire simultaneously along an 80-mile front. The ground shakes like the earth itself is dying. Trees explode into splinters. Men are vaporized where they stand. American soldiers who were sleeping 60 seconds ago are now burning alive in their foxholes. The temperature is 12 degrees below zero, and the forest is on fire. In the first 3 hours alone, over 8,000 Americans are killed, wounded, or captured. 3 entire divisions are obliterated. And Hitler's generals are screaming into their radios with a single word: Vorwärts. Forward. In Washington, the Pentagon goes silent. In London, Churchill stops mid-sentence. And in a smoke-filled room in Versailles, one man stares at a map and realizes that everything the entire Allied war effort is about to collapse. His name is Dwight D. Eisenhower, and in 72 hours a man he both loves and despises will walk through that door uninvited, unannounced, and make a promise so insane that half the room will think he's lost his mind. That man will promise to move 133,000 soldiers 75 miles through a blizzard in 3 days and attack the most powerful German offensive since 1940. And somehow impossibly, he will keep that promise. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next video. Join us as we uncover more stories, historical events, and inspiring moments from the past. This community is built for people who believe that history is the greatest story ever told, and we're just getting started. This is the story of George S. Patton, the Battle of the Bulge, and the most audacious military maneuver of World War II. And it begins not with a general, but with a catastrophe. To understand what Patton walked into on December 19, 1944, you have to understand just how catastrophic the situation was in those first 72 hours of the German offensive. Operation Watch on the Rhine was Hitler's final gamble. His generals had told him it was suicide. His logistics officers had told him the fuel simply didn't exist. His intelligence staff had told him the Americans would react faster than he expected. Hitler fired 3 of them and kept planning. 25 German divisions, including 9 panzer divisions, 410,000 men, and over 1,400 tanks, punched through the weakest point in the Allied line. The Ardennes sector was held by 4 American divisions, some fresh and untested, some exhausted from months of combat. The Germans had chosen this ground deliberately. Thick forest, narrow roads, fog so dense that Allied aircraft couldn't fly, and a cold so brutal that rifle mechanisms froze and men's fingers blackened with frostbite within hours. The 106th Infantry Division had been in their positions for exactly 5 days when the German barrage hit. 2 of their regiments, the 422nd and 423rd, were completely surrounded by December 19th. Over 8,000 men surrendered. It was the largest mass capitulation of American forces in the entire European theater, a record that still stands today. The 28th Infantry Division, already shattered from months of fighting in the Hürtgen Forest, was torn apart again. Entire battalions simply ceased to exist. And driving through these gaps came the armored spearheads of the SS Panzer divisions. Kampfgruppe Piper, commanded by SS Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Piper, drove 60 miles into American lines in the first 48 hours. On December 17th, at a crossroads near Malmedy, his men stopped a convoy of American prisoners in a snow-covered field. They took the 84 prisoners. They lined them up, and they shot them all. The Malmedy massacre spread through American ranks like wildfire, not as a story of defeat, as a vow of vengeance. By December 19th, the situation at SHAEF headquarters in Versailles had reached a breaking point. The German Bulge had punched 50 miles deep into Allied territory. The vital road junction of Bastogne faced encirclement from 3 directions, and the 101st Airborne Division was racing in open trucks through the freezing night, trying to reach the town before the Germans cut it off completely. Eisenhower's Chief of Staff, Lieutenant General Walter Bedell Smith, wrote in his diary that night, The boss looks 10 years older. This is the worst crisis we've confronted since D-Day. The emergency conference on December 19th assembled every senior Allied commander within reach: Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, Air Marshal Arthur Tedder. They gathered around maps spread across every flat surface, debating options in the cigarette smoke and cold air. The dominant view was caution. Montgomery spoke of methodical withdrawal to more defensible lines. Bradley was devastated, this catastrophe unfolding in his own Army Group sector. Staff officers discussed timelines for a counterattack measured in weeks, perhaps a month. Then the door opened. No knock, no announcement, no phone call ahead. A figure stepped in from the cold cavalry boots gleaming despite the mud outside, ivory-handled revolvers at his hips, face burned red from the December wind. He hadn't requested authorization. He hadn't waited for an invitation. He had simply climbed into his jeep at 3rd Army Headquarters 175 miles away and driven through the night. Eisenhower looked up from the maps. Several officers present later described what passed across the Supreme Commander's face in that moment: surprise, exasperation, and something that looked very much like relief. He shook his head slowly and said, according to Omar Bradley's memoir, A Soldier's Story, words that carried equal parts frustration and admiration. God, this is Patton. George Smith. Patton Jr. was 59 years old in December 1944. He had been fired twice, publicly humiliated once, and had survived more career-ending scandals than any other general in American history. He had also won more ground, moved more men, and destroyed more enemy divisions than any commander on the Western Front. He was simultaneously the most valuable and most difficult asset the Allied armies possessed. He was born in 1885 in San Gabriel, California, into a family soaked in military tradition. His grandfather had died leading a Confederate charge at Cedar Creek. His great-uncle had commanded the 22nd Virginia Infantry. Patton grew up reading Caesar's Gallic Wars and Stonewall Jackson's campaigns the way other boys read adventure novels. He spoke about war the way artists speak about beauty, as something to be studied, practiced, mastered, and ultimately loved. He struggled with reading as a child, likely due to dyslexia, but memorized vast passages of military history by ear. He graduated from West Point in 1909 and immediately began studying every battle, every campaign, every general who had ever moved large bodies of men across contested ground. He competed in the 1912 Olympic Games in the modern pentathlon, finishing 5th overall, and would have placed higher had he not been penalized in the pistol competition because his bullets passed through the target so cleanly that judges couldn't count the holes. He was a man built from the molecular level up for combat. By December 19, 1944, Patton's Third Army had liberated more territory in less time than any formation in the war. They had raced 400 miles across France in 6 weeks after the Normandy breakout. They had destroyed over 1,000 German tanks and taken 100,000 prisoners. His men had a saying: "An empty gas tank stops Patton. Nothing else does." But what nobody in that conference room knew, what Patton had told no one, was what he had been doing for the previous 3 days. When the German offensive hit on December 16th, while other commanders were still trying to understand the scale of what was happening, Patton had immediately recognized it for what it was: not just a crisis, but an opportunity. The Germans had come out from behind their fortifications. They had extended their supply lines into the open. Their flanks were exposed, and the fastest army on the Western Front was sitting 150 miles to the south, pointed in the wrong direction. Patton had convened his staff within hours of the first German attack. He had given them a single order: prepare 3 separate contingency plans for attacking the German penetration from the south at different angles for different scenarios. His operations officer, Colonel Halley Maddox, and his chief of staff, Brigadier General Hobart Gay, worked without sleep for 72 hours. They designated units. They calculated fuel requirements. They mapped road networks. They identified which bridges could handle tank traffic in winter conditions. They had done everything except actually move. Because Patton was still under orders to continue his offensive toward the Saar River. Moving without authorization would have ended his career permanently. So he planned. He prepared. He waited. And then he drove through the night to Versailles to make a promise that should have been impossible. He walked to the map without waiting to be invited. He traced his finger along the southern edge of the German penetration through Luxembourg and up toward Bastogne, and he said 4 words that made the room go quiet. "We can attack on the 22nd. December 22nd, 3 days away. The room erupted. A British liaison officer pointed out that Patton's supply lines would be impossibly stretched. A logistics officer noted that the roads were already jammed with retreating American units and Belgian refugees. Air Marshal Tedder later wrote that he thought Patton had finally overreached, that what he proposed violated every principle of military logistics. Eisenhower leaned forward. He had known Patton since North Africa. He had shielded him after the slapping incidents. He had sidelined him and brought him back and sidelined him again. He knew better than anyone alive both the limits and the limitlessness of the man standing at his map. He asked one question. "When did you start planning this?" Patton grinned. "December 16th, the day they attacked." The room went completely silent. Eisenhower stood up. He walked around the desk until he was face to face with Patton. Multiple witnesses, including Bradley and Eisenhower's own naval aide Harry Butcher, recorded what happened next. Eisenhower looked at the assembled officers and said, "Gentlemen, General Patton has just made us a promise that sounds impossible. I've learned something about George over the years." He turned back to Patton. "When something sounds impossible, that's usually when he's most dangerous." The meeting ended. Commanders dispersed. And the moment Patton walked out that door, the countdown began. He drove through the night to Nancy, arriving at 2:30 a.m. on December 20th. His staff was waiting. The orders were already drafted. Patton looked at the assembled officers and said 2 words, "We're going." What happened in the next 72 hours was not a military operation. It was a controlled explosion of human will. The 4th Armored Division received movement orders at 4 a.m. on December 20th. They were positioned near Saarbrücken, 150 miles from their new assembly areas in Luxembourg. They had 10,937 men, 127 medium tanks, 77 light tanks, and hundreds of support vehicles. Major General Hugh Gaffey, their commander, later recalled looking at the weather report and seeing 12 inches of snow expected and thinking, "We're going to attempt something that can't be done." The 26th Infantry Division marched through snow and sleet, covering their entire reorientation in 48 hours. The 88th Infantry Division pivoted from attacking east to attacking north and covered nearly 100 miles of frozen Belgian road. In total, 133,000 men, 3,244 tanks and tank destroyers, 11,000 vehicles, and enough ammunition to fight a sustained battle moved into position in 3 days. Colonel Maddox, the operations officer, who had built the contingency plans, wrote afterward, "If someone had told me in advance what we were going to do, I would have said it needed at least 10 days. Patton did it in 3. I still don't understand how." The answer was not magic. It was not inspiration. It was obsession. Patton personally drove up and down the columns in his Jeep. When he found bottlenecks, he got out and directed traffic himself. A 3-star general standing on an icy Belgian road, waving tanks through an intersection in the snow. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commanding the 37th Tank Battalion of the 4th Armored, remembered encountering Patton at a jackknifed supply convoy blocking the road. Patton walked up to the drivers, told them they had 5 minutes to clear the road, or he would have tanks push their vehicles into the ditch, then looked at Abrams and said, "Colonel, every hour you waste here is another American soldier dying in Bastogne. Move." The trucks were clear in 3 minutes. While Patton's army raced north, Bastogne was being strangled. The 101st Airborne Division had reached the town on December 19th, the same day Patton made his promise. By December 20th, German forces from the 2nd Panzer Division, the Panzerlehr Division, and the 26th Volksgrenadier Division had completely encircled the town. 7 major roads converged on Bastogne. If it fell, the Germans would have an open corridor to the Meuse River. The entire Allied position in Belgium could unravel within days. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe commanded the garrison, 18,000 men, nearly out of artillery ammunition, nearly out of medical supplies, operating in temperatures that killed men who stopped moving. On December 21st, German commanders sent a formal delegation under a white flag demanding the town's surrender. The written ultimatum was precise and correct. The garrison was surrounded, relief was impossible, continued resistance was futile. McAuliffe read the note. He looked at his staff. He wrote one word on a piece of paper and handed it back to the German delegates. Nuts. The German officers didn't understand the American slang. McAuliffe's operations officer explained it means go to hell. Bastogne would hold, but it could not hold forever. And 35 miles to the south in the frozen darkness of the Belgian countryside, 133,000 men were moving as fast as frozen roads and human endurance allowed. On the night of December 21st, Patton wrote in his diary, "We attack in the morning. If we fail, Bastogne falls. If Bastogne falls, the whole front could collapse. Everything depends on the next 48 hours. Either we pull off a miracle, or we hand Hitler his last victory." Then he knelt down, asked his chaplain to compose a prayer for clear weather, had it printed on cards and distributed to every soldier in 3rd Army, and went to sleep for 4 hours. December 22nd, 1944, 5:59 a.m. Patton's artillery opens fire. But what happens when 133,000 men charge straight into the most powerful German offensive since 1940 through blizzard conditions against veteran SS troops, who have already shattered 3 American divisions, is something no one in that conference room could have predicted. In Part 2, we'll follow Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams and the 4th Armored Division as they slam into the steel wall of the German southern flank and discover just how close Patton's impossible promise came to dying in the snow. 3 days ago, George Patton walked uninvited into Eisenhower's headquarters and made a promise that stunned every senior commander in the room. He would move 133,000 men, 75 miles through a blizzard pivot, an entire army 90 degrees north, and attack the most powerful German offensive since 1940. All within 72 hours. And he did it. His artillery opened fire at 5:59 a.m. on December 22, 1944, and 3 divisions charged north into the frozen Belgian darkness toward Bastogne. But here is what nobody told you about that first day of the counterattack. By nightfall, on December 22nd, after 14 hours of continuous fighting, Patton's lead elements had advanced exactly 6 miles. Bastogne was still 35 miles away, and between Abrams and that surrounded garrison stood the full weight of the German southern flank 45,000 veteran soldiers who had already shattered 3 American divisions and were now turning to face this new threat with everything they had left. At Supreme Headquarters in Versailles, the phones were ringing. And not everyone was impressed. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery had been granted command of all Allied forces north of the Bulge on December 20th, a political decision that had already infuriated Bradley and Patton equally. Montgomery studied the situation maps on the evening of December 22nd and reached a conclusion that was, by his own standards, entirely logical. Patton's attack was moving too slowly. The corridor being cut was too narrow. The flanks were dangerously exposed, and pressing forward with insufficient consolidation risked creating a second encirclement, this time of American forces instead of German ones. He called Eisenhower directly. Dwight Montgomery said, his voice carrying the measured patience of a man who believed he was the only adult in the room. Patton is going to exhaust his divisions against prepared positions and achieve nothing except a longer casualty list. You need to pull him back to a defensible line and let me coordinate a proper counteroffensive. 2 weeks. Give me 2 weeks and I'll roll them up cleanly. Eisenhower listened. He did not agree. But he listened because Montgomery commanded British forces and Churchill was watching, and the politics of coalition warfare were as real as any German tank. The pressure arrived at Patton's headquarters the following morning, December 23rd, in the form of a message from Schaeff suggesting that Third Army consider consolidating current gains before resuming offensive operations. Patton read the message once, handed it back to his aide, and said, "Tell them we are consolidating. We're consolidating our position in Bastogne." Then he got in his jeep and drove to the front. He found Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams at the head of the 37th Tank Battalion, outside the village of Bougainville, studying a German defensive line that blocked the road north. Abrams was 29 years old, built like a boxer, and had been fighting continuously for 4 days, on almost no sleep. He looked at Patton without ceremony and said what he saw. "They've got anti-tank guns covering every approach, sir. 3 Shermans went up in the first 10 minutes yesterday. If we go straight at them, we're going to lose half the battalion." Patton looked at the map. He looked at the village. He looked at the tree line to the left, a forest that every tactical manual said was impassable for armor in winter conditions. Then he looked at Abrams. How long to push through that wood? Abrams thought for exactly 3 seconds. 4 hours if we're lucky. Could get stuck and lose the whole flank. And if you go straight at the guns, we crack through in 90 minutes, we'll lose 8, maybe 10 tanks. Patton nodded once, then go straight at them. We don't have 4 hours. He paused, and his voice dropped to something that was not theatrical, not performed, simply absolute. Abrams, there are 18,000 Americans in Bastogne, running out of ammunition and eating captured German rations. Every tank you lose today saves 10 men tomorrow. Go. Abrams went. What happened at Bougainville on December 23rd became a case study in violent momentum. The 37th Tank Battalion attacked in column formation directly into the German anti-tank screen. The 1st Sherman was hit within 60 seconds and burst into flames in the road. The 2nd tank swerved around the burning wreck without slowing. The 3rd was hit and kept moving, trailing smoke and fire. Abrams was in the 4th tank, standing in the turret directing fire, while German shells impacted 20 meters to his left. His gunner destroyed 2 anti-tank guns in the first 3 minutes. The column punched through the village in 94 minutes. The cost was 9 tanks and 31 men. The Germans lost the position entirely and fell back 4 miles. 9 tanks for 4 miles. At that rate, the math was brutal, but the math was changing. Because on the morning of December 23rd, something else happened that no prayer card and no military plan had guaranteed. The weather broke. After 5 days of fog, snow, and sleet so thick that Allied aircraft had been completely grounded, the sky over Belgium cleared to a cold, hard, brilliant blue, and within 2 hours, the air above the battlefield filled with American aircraft. 472 P-47, Thunderbolts, and P-51 Mustangs dropped from the sky onto German armored columns that had been moving in complete safety for a week. C-47 transport planes, 241 of them, formed a stream over Bastogne and dropped 144 tons of supplies directly into the besieged town: ammunition, morphine, plasma food. The paratroopers of the 101st, who had been operating on captured German rations and improvised bandages, watched the sky fill with parachutes and simply stood in the snow and cheered. The air support changed everything on the ground. German armor that had been moving freely now burned on open roads. Fuel convoys that the Wehrmacht had scraped together from reserves across the Reich were destroyed before they reached the front, and Patton's infantry, who had been grinding forward against prepared positions with no overhead cover, suddenly had fighter bombers screaming in ahead of every advance to suppress the German guns. On December 23rd, the 4th Armored Division advanced 11 miles. The day before, they had managed 6. But the most brutal fighting was still ahead. December 24th, Christmas Eve, the temperature dropped to 5 degrees Fahrenheit. The roads became black ice, And between Abrams and Bastogne, 7 miles of open Belgian countryside, lay the village of Chaumont, held by elements of the 5th Fallschirmjäger Division, reinforced with assault guns and positioned behind minefields that covered every approach from the south. Abrams studied Chaumont through binoculars for 40 minutes. The minefields were real. The defensive positions were textbook. A flanking maneuver would take the rest of the day, and there was no rest of the day left to spend. Intelligence had just reported that German forces were moving to close the corridor behind Third Army. If Abrams didn't push through Chaumont by nightfall, the window might close permanently. He ordered his tanks into column, 5 Shermans abreast at the front. Maximum speed from the first second. At 1 p.m. on December 24th, Combat Command A of the 4th Armored Division charged straight down the road toward Chaumont at 15 miles per hour. German anti-tank guns opened fire immediately. The lead Sherman took a direct hit and stopped dead in the road. The second tank swerved around it and kept going. The third was hit in the track, spun sideways, and kept firing as it ground to a halt. The column didn't slow. Abrams' tank crashed through a roadblock at the village entrance, scattering timber and frozen earth. Infantry and half-tracks followed 10 seconds behind, dismounting to clear buildings, while the tanks pushed through. 2 hours later, Chaumont was in American hands. Combat Command A had lost 8 tanks and 53 men killed or wounded. The last major defensive line between Patton and Bastogne was gone. On the night of December 24th, Patton wrote a single line in his diary. "We attack at dawn. No excuses, no delays. We reach Bastogne tomorrow, or we die trying." Then he attended a brief Christmas Eve chapel service, returned to his desk, and worked until 3 a.m. December 25th, 1944. The coldest Christmas day in Belgian history. Fog rolled back in at dawn, cutting visibility to 100 yards. The roads were pure ice, and at 6:30 a.m. Creighton Abrams led the 37th Tank Battalion north through the frozen dark for the 4th consecutive day of continuous combat. They rolled through Remy-Champagne, through Clochemont, against sporadic German resistance from units that were exhausted, undersupplied, and beginning to understand that the offensive had failed. Some positions fought with the ferocity of men who had nothing left to lose. Others melted back into the forest. At 2 p.m., Abrams' lead tanks crested a ridge and looked down into a valley. In the center of that valley, surrounded by smoke and German artillery impact craters, was Bastogne. Between the tanks and the town, the village of Eisenhower. 500 German soldiers. Panzerfausts in every window. Abrams formed his tanks into a wedge and attacked without pausing to think about it. 2 Shermans were knocked out in the first minute. 3 more were hit and kept rolling. Abrams' own tank crashed through a roadblock and burst out the far side of Eisenhower, still firing. At 4:45 p.m. on Christmas Day, 1944, the lead tank of C Company 37th Tank Battalion rolled through the 101st Airborne's forward perimeter. First Lieutenant Charles Bogus reached down from his turret and shook hands with the first paratrooper he found. "We're from the 4th Armored," he said. "Patton sent us." The siege of Bastogne was broken. The impossible promise had been kept. But in Berlin, Hitler was not finished. And in the days that followed, something far more dangerous than the initial German offensive began to take shape. The Germans who had encircled Bastogne were now themselves encircled on paper, but they were not surrendering. They were consolidating, regrouping, and preparing a counterattack along a new axis that Patton's staff had not anticipated. An attack not against the corridor itself, but against the weakest point in Third Army's entire line, 30 miles to the east, where a single understrength division held a front that should have required 3. In Part 3, we follow what happens when the most successful military movement of the Western campaign runs directly into the limits of what even Patton's army can sustain, and discover just how close Hitler came to making the whole thing fall apart. Bastogne was free. Creighton Abrams had kept his tanks moving for 4 consecutive days through blizzards, minefields, and SS anti-tank screens. Patton had kept his promise. And on Christmas night 1944, 133,000 American soldiers exhaled for the first time in a week. But in the forests east of the corridor, something dangerous was happening. German intelligence had spent 72 hours analyzing exactly how Patton had moved so fast, and what they concluded terrified them. Because if Third Army could pivot an entire corps in 3 days, the Germans had badly miscalculated how much time they had left. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt received the analysis on December 26th. He read it twice. Then he summoned his chief of staff and said 5 words: "We must cut that corridor." The corridor connecting Patton's forces to Bastogne was at its narrowest point, less than 300 yards wide. A single road through frozen Belgian farmland, exposed on both flanks, supplied by trucks that drove through darkness to avoid German aircraft. It was not a triumph. It was a thread, and the Germans understood that if they could sever it in the next 48 hours, they could re-encircle Bastogne, destroy the 101st Airborne, and potentially collapse the entire southern shoulder of the Allied counteroffensive. Von Rundstedt ordered the 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division and elements of the Führer-Begleit Brigade, over 12,000 men and 87 tanks, to concentrate against the eastern face of the corridor near the village of L'Outrebois. The attack was scheduled for December 30th, and Third Army's intelligence had no idea it was coming. On December 27th, Patton's staff received reports that an understrength regiment of the 35th Infantry Division was holding a 6-mile front east of the corridor near Villers-le-Bon-Eau. 6 miles. A front that doctrine required 3 full regiments to defend. The 35th had been in combat for 3 weeks and had taken 40% casualties. They were exhausted, undersupplied, and holding ground that looked on the map like an invitation. Colonel Halley Maddox, Patton's operations officer, brought the report to headquarters at 11 p.m. on December 27th. He laid it on the map table and said nothing. Patton studied it for 2 minutes. Then he picked up the phone and called Major General Willard Paul, commanding the 26th Infantry Division. "Will Sepushin." Patton said, "I need a regiment at Villers by dawn on the 30th. Paul said it would strip his reserves completely. Patton said, "I know, do it." But there was a second problem, one that no amount of telephone calls could solve quickly. Patton's supply lines had reached their absolute limit. Third Army had consumed 2,000 tons of artillery ammunition in the first week of the counteroffensive. The trucks supplying the front were running on fumes, literally with fuel allocations cut to keep the tanks moving. 2 artillery battalions on the eastern flank had been rationed to 15 shells per gun per day. 15 shells. In the Hurtgen Forest, American artillery had fired 15 shells per gun per hour. General Hobart Gay raised the supply crisis at the morning briefing on December 28th. The numbers were stark. Third Army needed 3,500 tons of supplies per day to sustain offensive operations. They were receiving 2,100. The shortfall was not a logistics failure. It was a mathematical consequence of moving 133,000 men faster than the road network could support. The Army had outrun its own stomach. For the first time since December 19th, Patton's staff began asking the question nobody wanted to ask out loud. Not whether Bastogne had been worth it. Of course it had. But whether Third Army could sustain what it had started. Whether the momentum that had broken the German southern flank might now break against its own limitations. Whether Patton had promised more than even he could deliver. Patton listened to the briefing without interrupting. When Gay finished, Patton looked at the map for a long moment. Then he said, "Resupply the artillery on the eastern flank first. Pull ammunition from the rear depots if you have to. I don't care what we run short of. Not the guns." He paused. "The Germans are going to hit that flank. I don't know when, but they're going to hit it." He was right. And he was 3 days early. December 30th, 1944. 3 a.m., Villers-le-Bon-Eau, Belgium. The village was a collection of stone farmhouses on a low rise above frozen fields held by the 1st Battalion, 134th Infantry Regiment of the 35th Division. 312 men, 6 machine gun positions, 4 57mm anti-tank guns that had not been resupplied in 4 days, and on the road coming out of the eastern darkness, 87 German tanks. The Führer-Bakelite Brigade hit the American outposts at 3:15 a.m. The first 2 machine gun positions were overrun in 11 minutes. German infantry moving in the darkness behind the tanks cleared the farm buildings on the eastern edge of the village with grenades and submachine guns. The American battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Omer Dewey, was on the radio to regiment within 4 minutes of first contact. "We are being hit by armor and infantry. Multiple directions. I need artillery now." Regiment called division. Division called corps. Corps called 3rd Army Artillery. The request went through 4 levels of command in 6 minutes, which was fast. But by the time the first American artillery rounds fell on the German approach routes, the lead Panther tanks were already inside Villers. Dewey pulled his remaining men into 3 stone buildings in the center of the village and turned them into a perimeter. The anti-tank guns went to the windows. The machine guns covered the streets. And for the next 4 hours, 312 American soldiers held the center of Villers-le-Bon-Eau against a German force 30 times their size. The artillery saved them. Patton's standing order to prioritize eastern flank ammunition meant that when the call came, the guns had shells to fire. 12 battalions of 3rd Army Artillery, 144 guns, shifted onto the Villers sector within 20 minutes of Dewey's first call. The concentration of fire that fell on the German approach routes east and south of the village was by any mathematical measure devastating. A German after-action report recovered after the war described the artillery as continuous and accurate beyond expectation, and noted that 2 full companies of Panzer Grenadiers were destroyed before they could dismount from their vehicles. The Panther tanks inside Villers were cut off from their infantry. They pushed through the village, took fire from the anti-tank guns at ranges under 100 meters, and lost 4 vehicles in 20 minutes. Without infantry support armor in a built-up area is nearly blind. The Panther commanders knew it. At 6:40 a.m., the German armor began pulling back through the village. Dewey's men followed them to the edge of the buildings and kept firing. At 7:15 a.m., the relief column from the 26th Infantry Division arrived from the west. 2 fresh battalions with their own artillery forward observers hit the German eastern flank, while Dewey's survivors held the center. The 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division, which had committed 6 hours and 12,000 men to cutting the Bastogne corridor, broke contact and withdrew northeast at 9 a.m. They left behind 34 tanks and assault guns destroyed or abandoned in the frozen fields around Villers. They had killed 67 Americans. They had not cut the corridor. Sergeant James Hendricks of the 4th Armored Division, who had been moving supplies along the corridor road during the German attack and could hear the artillery from Villers throughout the night, later wrote in a letter home, "We didn't know until morning what had happened. We just kept driving. Then we heard the guns stop and someone said they held, and that was it. We kept driving." Patton received the Villers report at 9:30 a.m. on December 30th. He read it, set it down, and said to Gay, "Resupply Dewey's battalion today. Personal priority." Then he went back to the map. The German failure at Villers was the last serious attempt to sever the Bastogne corridor. Von Rundstedt reported to Hitler on January 1, 1945, that the offensive had culminated. The fuel was gone. The reserve divisions were gone. The American counteroffensive was widening daily, and Third Army showed no sign of stopping. Hitler refused to accept the report and ordered another attack. Von Rundstedt sent it anyway. By January 8, 1945, Hitler authorized the withdrawal of the SS Panzer divisions from the Bulge. The units that had launched the most powerful German offensive in 5 years were pulling back toward the Rhine, leaving behind 600 tanks, 1,600 artillery pieces, and over 100,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. The Americans had suffered 75,000 casualties in the Battle of the Bulge. But the Germans had suffered them too, and the Germans had no replacements. The Americans did. Patton's Third Army had destroyed more German armored strength in 3 weeks than the entire Eastern Front had seen in the previous 3 months of fighting. The 4th Armored Division alone had accounted for 312 German tanks and assault guns between December 22nd and January 15th. Creighton Abrams's 37th Tank Battalion had been cited for extraordinary valor in 4 separate engagements. Abrams himself would receive the Distinguished Service Cross. The wider effect was impossible to calculate precisely, but unmistakable in its direction. The German army that retreated from the Bulge in January 1945 was not the same army that had attacked in December. It had spent its last offensive reserves. It had lost irreplaceable experienced officers and NCOs. It had consumed fuel and ammunition that could never be replaced. Every general on both sides understood what that meant. The war in the West would end not in months, but in weeks. Von Rundstedt said it plainly in his post-war interrogation. After the Bulge failed, I told Hitler the war was over. He did not believe me, but the soldiers knew. And now, in the cold silence after the guns stopped, a different question began to form, not about tactics or logistics or the number of tanks destroyed, about the man who had made one impossible promise on December 19th and kept every word of it, about what drove someone to attempt what no other commander had even considered, about what it costs to be the person the army calls when nothing else will work. That question has an answer. And it is darker, stranger, and more human than anything that happened on the battlefield. In Part 4, we follow George Patton into the final months of the war and discover the price he paid for being exactly what Eisenhower needed him to be. From December 16th to January 15th, George Patton had moved 133,000 men through a blizzard. Broken, the siege of Bastogne stopped the last great German offensive of the war and held the corridor against a 12,000-man counterattack at Villers-le-Bon-Eau. He had done everything he promised and several things he hadn't mentioned. The Battle of the Bulge was over. The road to Berlin was open. But this story has a final chapter that most history books skip past in a single paragraph, because the man who saved Bastogne did not get a hero's ending. He got something stranger, sadder, and ultimately more revealing than any victory parade. And it begins not with a battle, but with a press conference. On April 14, 1945, 3 weeks before Germany's surrender, Patton made a statement to American journalists that his staff immediately recognized as catastrophic. He compared the Nazi Party to the Democratic and Republican parties back home, suggesting that most Germans who had joined it were simply politicians, and that excluding them entirely from post-war administration was impractical. The comment was technically defensible as an administrative observation. As a public statement by the most famous American general in Europe, it was a disaster. The reaction was immediate. Washington erupted. Veterans organizations sent cables to Eisenhower. Newspapers that had celebrated Patton for 3 years turned against him within 48 hours. Eisenhower, who had protected Patton through the slapping incidents, through the Soviet comments, through a dozen lesser controversies, called him to Frankfurt and relieved him of command of Third Army on October 2, 1945. Patton sat across the desk from Eisenhower in silence for a moment after hearing the decision. Then he said, according to Eisenhower's aide, who was present outside the room, "I understand, Ike." That was all. No argument. No appeal. The man who had driven up and down frozen Belgian roads directing traffic in December, who had promised the impossible and delivered it, accepted the end of his combat command without a word of protest. He was given command of the 15th Army, a paper formation responsible for writing the official history of the European campaign. It was by any measure a posting designed to keep him visible without giving him anything real to do. Patton spent his days reviewing documents and dictating notes and telling his staff that he wanted to go to the Pacific to Japan, where there was still fighting to be done. He never got there. On December 8, 1945, Exactly 1 year and 8 days after his artillery had opened fire on the German southern flank, Patton was involved in a car accident outside Mannheim, Germany. A truck turned across his staff car at low speed. The collision was minor by any physical standard. But Patton, who had survived 3 wars and more combat than any general of his generation, was thrown forward in the seat and broke his neck. He was paralyzed from the neck down. He died 12 days later, on December 21, 1945, in a hospital in Heidelberg. He was 60 years old. His wife, Beatrice, who had waited through 40 years of military postings and 2 world wars, was at his bedside. His last coherent words recorded by the attending physician were, "This is a hell of a way to die." He was buried in Luxembourg at the American Military Cemetery at Ham among the soldiers of Third Army who had died in the Battle of the Bulge. He had requested it specifically, not Arlington, not West Point, with his men. The generals who had doubted him in that conference room on December 19th lived long and largely comfortable lives. Montgomery wrote his memoirs and spent 20 years arguing that he had been the architect of Allied victory. Bradley became Army Chief of Staff and then the first general of the armies since Pershing. Eisenhower became President of the United States. None of them in their various memoirs and interviews and retrospectives ever disputed what Patton had accomplished in those 10 days in December. The man they had questioned, whose promise had seemed insane, had been right in every particular. But Patton's real legacy was not written in memoirs. It was written in the doctrine that his Third Army's performance produced, and in the generations of soldiers who studied what happened in the Ardennes, and drew conclusions that shaped every major conflict that followed. The operational concept that Patton demonstrated in December 1944, what military theorists came to call deep operations, combined with operational tempo, became the foundational principle of American armored warfare for the next half-century. The idea that an army could move faster than the enemy could respond, could pivot and strike before defenses could be organized, was not new in theory. Patton had proven it was achievable in practice in winter against veteran opposition in 72 hours. The United States Army studied the Bastogne relief operation in detail throughout the 1950s and integrated its lessons into the training programs at Fort Knox and Fort Leavenworth. When American armored divisions deployed to Korea, their commanders carried doctrine shaped directly by what Abrams and Gaffey had done in Belgium. Creighton Abrams himself, the 29-year-old battalion commander who had led the charge through Chaumont on Christmas Eve, rose to become Army Chief of Staff, and the man for whom the M1 Abrams main battle tank was named in 1979. Every M1 that has fought in every conflict since in the Gulf War in Iraq and Afghanistan carries the name of the officer who proved that armor could move faster than anyone thought possible. The operational tempo concept traveled further still. When General Norman Schwarzkopf planned the ground campaign for Operation Desert Storm in 1991, the famous left hook that enveloped Iraqi forces in Kuwait, his staff explicitly referenced the Bastogne relief operation as a template for rapid armored envelopment. The 100-hour ground campaign that destroyed the Iraqi army in 1991 was in measurable ways an inheritance from those 10 days in December 1944. The lineage runs direct. By any accounting of lives saved and wars shortened, the numbers are staggering. The Battle of the Bulge, had it succeeded, would have split the Allied armies and potentially extended the European war by 6 to 12 months, according to post-war analyses by both American and German military historians. At the casualty rates of late 1944, 6 months more of war in Europe meant somewhere between 200,000 and 400,000 additional American deaths. Patton's 10-day operation did not single-handedly prevent all of that, but it broke the offensive that might have made it possible. The corridor to Bastogne, measured in the frozen ground between Arlon and the 101st Airborne's perimeter, was less than 4 miles wide at its narrowest point. 4 miles that may have been worth hundreds of thousands of lives. The lesson that Patton's career offers is not despite appearances about audacity. Plenty of generals have been audacious and gotten their men killed for nothing. The lesson is about preparation wearing the mask of audacity. When Patton stood in Eisenhower's conference room on December 19th and promised to attack in 3 days, every officer in that room heard a gamble. What they didn't know was that Patton had been planning for that exact moment since December 16th, that his staff had 3 separate contingency plans ready, that the supply calculations had already been run, that the unit designations had already been made. The promise sounded insane because the preparation was invisible. That is the pattern that repeats across military history whenever a new idea breaks through institutional resistance. Billy Mitchell, arguing for strategic air power in the 1920s, court-martialed for his trouble, vindicated by every bombing campaign of World War II. Chester Nimitz, insisting on submarine warfare against Japanese supply lines, while the surface fleet admirals pushed for carrier battles. Curtis LeMay, redesigning the entire B-29 bombing campaign against Japan after conventional high-altitude precision bombing failed, switching to low-altitude incendiary raids that the Air Force's own doctrine said were suicidal. Each of these appeared to be recklessness. Each was underneath exhaustive preparation that the institutions surrounding them could not yet see. The institutions resist because institutions are built to preserve what worked last time. That is not a flaw. It is in most circumstances a feature. Armies that abandoned proven doctrine for every new theory would be chaotic and ineffective. But the cost of institutional conservatism is paid in the moments when last time's solution genuinely will not work, when the situation has changed faster than the doctrine, when someone needs to stand in a smoke-filled room and say something that sounds impossible. Here is the detail that almost no one knows: the fact that the official histories mention in footnotes, and that rarely makes it into the popular accounts of the Bastogne relief. On the morning of December 22, 1944, the day Patton's attack began, Eisenhower received a private message from General George Marshall in Washington. Marshall had been monitoring the situation since December 16th and had formed his own view of Patton's promise. The message, declassified in 1979 and available in the Eisenhower Presidential Library, said simply, "I leave the decision to you. But if Patton fails, we will need to relieve him immediately to preserve confidence in the command structure. There can be no middle outcome." Eisenhower read it, initialed it, and filed it. He told no one, including Patton. He had already given his order. He was not going to complicate it with a conditional that he had no intention of honoring anyway. But the message reveals something important. The bet that Eisenhower made on December 19th was not only military, it was personal. If Patton had failed, if the corridor had not reached Bastogne, if the German counterattack at Villers had cut the line, Eisenhower would have relieved the best combat commander on the Western Front, in the middle of the worst crisis of the European campaign, and done it under direct pressure from Washington. The Supreme Commander had staked his own judgment completely on a man driving through the night from 175 miles away, who hadn't even been invited to the meeting. That is the part of the story that matters most. Not the artillery, not the tank charges, not the frozen roads and the Christmas Eve assault on Chaumont. The part that matters is 2 men, one of whom drove through the night because he already knew what needed to be done, and one of whom said yes when every rational voice in the room said, "Wait." George Patton moved 133,000 men through a blizzard in 3 days, broke the siege of Bastogne, stopped Germany's last offensive, and shortened the war in Europe by a margin that cannot be precisely calculated, but was certainly measured in hundreds of thousands of lives. He died in a car accident 12 days after the first anniversary of the battle that defined him, buried among his soldiers in Luxembourg because he asked to be. The tank that bears the name of the man who led his spearhead still serves in the armies of 16 nations. And the lesson after 4 hours and 4 parts and 10 days in December 1944 is exactly this. The difference between impossible and accomplished is almost always preparation. That nobody saw trust, that nobody guaranteed, and one person willing to make a promise and drive through the night to keep it. If you know another story like this one, a moment when one decision changed everything, share it in the comments. There are hundreds of them buried in the history of this war alone, and we are just getting started. Subscribe and turn on notifications because the next story is already coming. History does not remember the cautious. It remembers the ones who said they would and did.